Thanks a lot, Mary, and everyone for coming. So I'm going to start by sort of recapping what I've done since I was last here. It's really, really nice to be back. But I'll give you a little slideshow. It's been 5 years, oops, this doesn't work.
Yeah, that's how we like it in this building, is if things don't really work. Doesn't even work at the...
Oh, did I do that?
No, I did.
Okay. Okay, so that's Josiah, who's now two years and 3 months, and Boswell, the dog, and obviously Kate. So basically, I was going to talk about 3 things that have happened. So Josiah was one. The next one is we settled down in a boring suburb of Canberra, and then the last one is that I've turned. Oh, sorry. Oh, hang on. Yeah, I was going to talk about that too. So the boring suburb, is very nice, and we've tried to sort of to like it and to love Canberra. But that next photo, shows what we're up against. And so, Brisbane is clearly the better city.
Is it really? See, sorry to interrupt, but a lot of
of
people have said to me, "Oh, but you love Canberra when you moved there."
A lot of people don't.
Thank you for
I like it very much.
confirming what deep down I thought was the truth. But anyway,
Brisbane is easier to love for sure.
Yeah, right.
So I guess the third point is just that I've always been interested in constitutional theory and deliberative theory as well, and I've moved to sort of deeply divided societies and post-conflict, conflict settlement, and this is part of what Mary mentioned, that sort of legacy. It's turned in a more earnest direction in the past 5 years, I guess, and maybe that's because of if you click this, just settling down in a place that's a little bit dull and gives you a little bit of a midlife crisis, and so this is why perhaps I've moved in this direction. So, if you go to the next page, this is what I'm talking about today. Peacemaking referendums. So referendums are really common in places of conflict. So they've taken place, for example, in the places that you see there. And many more are planned, and as well, many more are likely. In the ideal, a referendum can draw on popular legitimacy to restart a stalled peace process. It might generate common feeling across disparate groups that are unaccustomed to seeing eye to eye. And it might actually sideline elites who might be spoilers, people like elites in the media or politics or the military. They might be spoilers of peacemaking, and so the referendum relatively sidelines them and sort of elevates the voice of people who are non-elite and who might be more eager to move on and reach an agreement. So, and also, because of the popular legitimacy behind a referendum, once a settlement is actually reached, arguably at least, you might find that it's harder to breach that settlement. So obviously not all of these ideals are really going to be met in a given case. In fact, in most of those cases, they weren't met. So it can happen that the referendum is poorly designed, it might mislead, it could intimidate or exclude classes of voters. And even if it's fair, it can aggravate tensions by further dividing people and sort of giving a greater kind of soapbox for people to divide and to conflict with each other. So it amplifies the voices of the many, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the voices of the sort of demagogic few. So now a peacemaking referendum is what I'm focused on here, but I'm interested in the process side of constitutional design here. So how do we design a process to design a new constitutional settlement to effect sort of greater peace? So the substance is obviously very important, but that's not what I'm focusing on here. So I've got 2 co-authors and working on a book. The co-authors are Ian O'Flynn in the UK and Hoi Kong in Canada. And basically we're interested in whether, despite the risks, referendums might actually be useful. So, and we're therefore contributing to the conflict literature, which is very big. But we're focusing on deliberative conflict studies. And this is something that's grown recently. But let me first explain what deliberative democracy is. So if you,
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
And maybe you're going to answer it already, but given your focus on process, does it matter what the outcome is for it to be successful?
No, I guess not, actually. That's a good... I mean, essentially, the outcome in terms of substance doesn't matter from my perspective, but the outcome in terms of peacemaking is all that really matters. So that's what I'm
Which
interested in.
could be consistent with the process being successful, but the outcome being not what was predicted, no?
Yeah. So I'm mostly agnostic about substance. In a given example, you might have consociationalism, you might have federation, you might have autonomy or whatever. And I think there are going to be arguments for each place for which of those is the best. And I'm not really as interested in that as in, well, how can you actually design the process of changing the Constitution so that people will accept, whatever the new system is, the new constitutional substance is. And if you can build that trust and acceptance, then people won't keep trying to revisit the question of what divides them. So that's the idea. That's okay.
So just on that point, the
I'm happy for
outcome is
interruptions.
more about unification or agreement or something, or...
So how did you start?
The outcome is probably then more about unification or agreement, or rather than like the actual...
Well, it's on...
As you say, the substance.
Yeah, exactly. So it might be that they are unified and in agreement on separation. So, but the point is that they're...
or consensus or something, that's probably what outcome is then.
Exactly, yeah. So that's actually, I'm not sure if I'll mention that, but we use the term overlapping consensus as the sort of Rawlsian term to describe what we're looking for. So just an agreement of some kind that hopefully will put the conflict to rest. Okay, so I'm interested in deliberative democracy. So what is that? So I won't go into too much detail, but basically I just want to address two questions that I tend to get when I talk about deliberative democracy. The first question is deliberation just the same as participation? They're not the same. So deliberation describes a kind of public participation that's coupled with decision-making that's relatively well-informed, reason-giving, other regarding, open-minded, flexible, and based on the so-called force of the better argument, rather than the force of superior numbers or the force of arms. So, and then the second question that usually follows is that even possible? And many people think it's not. I think that to answer that, what we need to do is to look at the empirical studies. And essentially, the studies show at least two things. One is that most democracies are not particularly deliberative. However, if you design them to be better, more deliberative, then they become more deliberative. So there are many examples in the empirical literature, which is huge, showing that people will actually deliberate if they're put under the right institutional conditions. So, for example, if they're informed, if they're given opportunities to be informed, that is, and if they're exposed to each other's perspectives, if they're given opportunities to reason. So I'm going to talk about mini publics a little bit later, and that's a really classic example of when you can do that. So basically I'm going to proceed on the assumption that deliberation is possible, because that's pretty well supported. But the question is the right institutional support being given to make that possible? And in particular, is it possible to deliberate amid conflict and in referendums? So deliberative democracy in conflict, that's something that a number of people have written about, including Ian, one of my co-authors, and Bora Kanra. It's the idea that instead of conflict of arms, for example, you have rationalistic, kind of reasoned adjudication. You can see why that would be an appealing alternative. So that's deliberative conflict studies. There's another sort of strand. So deliberative referendums is the other kind of strand that we're looking at, and this is a separate kind of sub-literature in the literature of deliberative democracy. So can you have deliberative referendums? So can you redesign a referendum so that it supports people's deliberation? And you can see why that would be important. If you go into a referendum and vote based on just the top of your head, then that's not going to be a really useful exercise. But then the last... the last sort of sort of heading here is deliberative referendums and conflict. So what if you bring together deliberative democracy and conflict with deliberative referendums? So it's very difficult to have deliberative democracy effectively within a place that's experiencing conflict. It's also difficult to make referendums more deliberative, but people have been writing about both of those things. But when you bring them together, it's that much harder. So admittedly, it becomes kind of like a double leap of faith. So very few people are writing about this, but this is what we're writing about. Can you design a deliberative referendum amid conflict? And because it's so common, as I showed you on that first screen, I think this is really necessary. You have to improve the referendum because the referendums become kind of the go-to method for changing constitutions in conflict areas. But they're generally failing in part because of their deliberative pathologies. And so really we need to, as much as possible, sort of develop the deliberativeness of referendums. Did you have?
Ron, I noticed on that map that you didn't colour in Australia because it's not like conflict.
That's a great question.
But like you're just making me think about the whole constitutional recognition of Indigenous people here, and whether. This is probably a question I should ask at the end, but whether you could apply something like that to that situation?
I have no objections to that. So I think that...
Because there's certainly conflict there, not conflict in the sense of a war, but conflict in the sense of just no meeting of,
Yeah, so I haven't actually defined conflict for this talk, but the way I define it is widespread communal violence, so group against group. But then, would that include the United States, for example? Would it include Australia, given our history? Are we post-conflict, or are we currently in conflict in some sense? So I think that you can stretch the definitions, and I think I'm not working on that, but I would in the future maybe.
Well, you could stretch it to any disagreement in society, so not just a
ideological
conflict type of situation, but even Brexit and just how you manage the deliberations and discussions as part of the process. So that I love your idea that what I think you're alluding to, that people need to be able to hear each other and understand each other's perspectives.
Definitely.
And that's part of this deliberative.
So this comes out of deliberative referendums work that's not in the context of conflict. So we start there, like in Australia, for example, and Scotland, and then the hard part is bringing those first two headings together into the third one, deliberative referendums and conflict, because this is going to be, for example, a place where there's little literacy, there's little infrastructure for communication and transportation, and where people are more divided than in Australia, let's say. So we're divided. I think all societies are divided in some ways, but it's a more or less question. And one of the significant things about the shotgun referendum, which is a deliberative referendum in a conflict area, is that it's coercive, as I'll mention a little bit later. And I think that you can only really be coercive like that in a conflict area where we're desperate to solve the conflict. So anyway, that photo is of what happened during the Colombian referendum for the Farc peace plan, and it's just there to illustrate the risks. So when you have a referendum, you might actually legitimate a new peace settlement, or you might not. So what happened in that case was that a 297-page agreement to end the conflict basically wasn't particularly well understood by people, and the people neither understood it nor were sort of ready to overcome their hatred for Farc, or vice versa. So that was a case where the people voted no, and that actually helped to frustrate a peace plan. Again, essentially, my aim with this book, our aim with this book, is to improve the referendum, which is already being widely used, to make it a little bit more deliberative at least. If you click on the next point there, so we're not trying to perfect the referendum, because you can't. Perfect deliberation is not possible. We're just doing what Archan Fang suggests here. Incremental development. If you can incrementally develop the referendum, you might incrementally improve the prospects of peacemaking. So on the next page, I just quickly mention. Oh no, sorry, this one here. Yeah, what a shotgun referendum is. So, sorry. So it's a deliberative referendum, like I mentioned before, but it's a peacemaking referendum as well. So we've given it this term, and the shotgun refers to the coercive aspect that I'll talk about soon.
Are there examples of the shotgun referendum?
Well, not really. So there have only been maybe one and a half referendums that have been sort of deliberative in the past. One of them is the Northern Ireland one from 20 years ago, but that's a kind of a poor example because they had such a well-established sort of liberal democracy there already.
Yeah.
So basically we're talking about something that's kind of blue sky. It hasn't been done yet, so we don't have empirical evidence to show that can be done. So this is what I'll talk about for the remainder. 3 points. First, I want to be a little bit more precise and detailed and tell you what a shotgun referendum can look like. And I'll talk about why it's coercive. And then I'll talk about its two objectives. One is to achieve settlement, in other words, to get people to sign an agreement, and then also to make that settlement endure. So basically, the referendum is not aiming to cause everyone in a society to deliberate better over time in a general way. It's just looking for a very kind of limited meeting of the minds on just the values in competition in a particular conflict. So I'll talk about this more. It's really just a fleeting meeting of the minds that we're trying to coerce in some ways. But then once you've done that, the hope is that you can get an enduring settlement because you make it constitutional. So the question is, how can you make something constitutional? You can't just call it constitutional. Many constitutions are breached. So the question is, how do you get sociological sort of legitimacy, as we call it in the book? How do you make a constitution be understood as a constitution? So if you can do that, then you might actually allow it to endure. So basically, to sum up, we've got this kind of fleeting moment where we're scaffolding a tenuous agreement through the shotgun referendum, and then hopefully the legitimacy of the shotgun referendum will then cause it to endure, because referendums tend to be a good way to signal that something is constitutional. So this is what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, in terms of how the referendum should look generically, it's generic because it can be modified for different societies. I'll just talk about 5 features. The first one is this generalized public value voting. So the referendum ballot basically would have 2 parts. The top part would be this value set of questions. So basically, you're looking at questions about values that are generalized in scope, which means that they're reasonably acceptable to all of the parties. So you're looking at something that isn't just a selfish sort of statement about what I want. It's really about more transcendent kind of values that might actually appeal to people more universally. So they rank these preferendum style. So you rank them 1 to 5, and or 1 to 4, and the key here is that they're generalized in the way they've been stated. So you have basically you have to vote for the particular value as it applies both to yourself and to the other side. So this is the coercive part here, that we're actually kind of essentially forcing people to think about things in a way that transcends their own perspective. So, and this relates to kind of the notion of kind of Rawls's veil of ignorance, for example, where you're trying to get people to think about things not from their own perspective, but in this case they actually do know what their perspective is, unlike people in a veil of ignorance situation. So here we're kind of essentially asking them to vote in a way that can't really just reflect their own interests. They have to be generalized. So that's the first part of the ballot, the value, the generalized public value voting aspect. But then we go to the bottom part, and you could do it simply and just ask a mandate question. So after you've been asked about particular values, you then, as the voter, get asked, well, do you want our community leaders to enter into negotiations to put an end to this conflict? And the more complicated version is that, so the more complicated version is where you'd have a number of particular reforms. And so in some places like Bougainville, for example, which might have a referendum next year, there have to be a number of options. So that's by law. That's sort of a decree that there have to be these options to choose from. So there are a few sort of benefits from. Sorry, if you can back up there, thanks. Sorry. A number of benefits to generalized value voting, and we talk about this at length in the book. But basically, it implicitly challenges private framings of values. So if you're looking to see how a value only benefits your side in conflict, you're sort of out of luck. You have to do some conceptual work to make a value apply privately, just to yourself or your group. So you might be able to do that, either through sort of poor logic or just laziness. But it does sort of expose to people that these sort of more transcendent universal values. Again, if you get a few more people to do this, then that's potentially a victory in itself. It's about incremental increases in deliberation. So there are other aspects there are other benefits, I guess. It might promote more purposive reasoning. So once you get to the institutional questions at the end, you will have actually thought about, well, which values actually matter to me. So when you choose a particular institution, you are looking at answering the question of why. What exactly is it that I'm pursuing here in terms of the purposes? The other thing is that it leads to more holistic reasoning. If you're looking at all these different values rather than just one single question. But I don't have enough time to go into that. But essentially, the point of this is to expose commonalities among groups rather than differences. And so whether this will work, we're really not sure. It hasn't been done. So the next feature is really a kind of a proviso, which is that the values that are on the ballot have to be just about the values that are in conflict in a particular conflict. So you've got to focus on those middle ones. If you click, so just to show that this is where we're focused, not on the broader set of values that might actually be at issue in a given society. So it's much less onerous to try to bring people together on this sort of limited set of values. And if we talked about everything, if we tried to improve deliberation about all values across the society, that would be unworkable. We're focusing on particular sets of values at a particular time. So, for example, in Northern Ireland, according to Thomas Hennessy, the historian, basically for a long time the parties were tinkering with different constitutional models like consociationalism and other sort of substantive models of constitutional change. And then eventually they got to the point where they decided to look at precisely what divided them, which is the question of who on the island of Ireland, is actually legitimate there. So is it the Catholics, is it the Protestants? They didn't have to come together as a matter of their identities. They didn't have to sort of become each other. They just had to sort of accept each other. So that was the limited value change, a change of values around identity that took place there, according to more than one scholar, actually. So we're not looking for a critical mass of people to move closer in identity or to become more politically accommodating or more deliberative in general. We're just focusing on something quite minimalist. And this is why I said that we're looking for a very sort of thin, tenuous agreement that hopefully can then be solidified as a constitutional settlement later on. So on the next... Oh, sorry. Yeah, so these are a couple of photographs from Northern Ireland 20 years ago. The exciting sort of news, and then the important people in Ireland celebrating at the bottom. That is Bono.
It's a weak face.
So on the next screen, I've got the third point, which is that basically we're looking to delimit or to sideline elites, and that's because they can be quite unhelpful. I'll talk about this a little bit later. The referendum focuses on non-elites.
Look, we're fine, actually.
What's that?
Well,
that's the thing. So I'm going to talk about this later. Isn't it strange for academics to sit around and talk about?
Eliminate all white men. I'm sorry.
I'm not white. I'm just. I gave a talk recently about how I'm not white. So anyway, we can talk about that.
Okay, we can talk about that later.
So basically, we're trying to sideline elites by running a referendum. We can't sideline them. Absolutely, you can't tell them not to speak. You can tell them not to speak in a misleading way. But mostly what we're doing here is relatively elevating non-elites by having a referendum. And at the end, they might actually give the elites a mandate to negotiate for peace. So the elite negotiators might actually be constrained by the particular values and the mandate that have been given to them to pursue. So this is basically a mandate referendum, which has a number of really interesting precedents in the past. So the picture there is of, so we've got two pictures here. On the left, 1961, the French referendum on Algeria, which was a mandate to pursue peace and independence for Algeria. On the right, there's a report on the white South African referendum that gave President de Klerk the mandate to pursue an end to apartheid and basically peace. And both these were incredibly successful. And what was really significant in both cases is that elites in politics, in the media, and elsewhere had been opponents of peacemaking, and they had sort of an outsized command over the political discourse. So they purported to speak on behalf of the public, about the zeitgeist, but they got it wrong. So their cynicism was not actually shared by the majority of people. And so on the Algerian question in France, 75% voted for peace. In South Africa, 68% of whites voted for peace. And so that was a really strong mandate to pursue peace. So the fourth point, mini publics, I won't say much about this, but basically it's a randomly selected group of citizens brought together to learn from experts and from each other, and then to decide through an extended period of deliberation on a particular question, such as what options to put on a referendum. So this is, I won't talk about it because it's really a well-established process. It's been done thousands of times. And this is where there's a lot of evidence that people can really deliberate well if they're given institutional support. So this is something that runs before a referendum to help make it more deliberative. And then the final point is that you have to inform people. So I've got a picture of Bougainvillean outreach by the UNDP. So when it comes to giving consent to a constitutional agreement, much as you would for a medical procedure, for example, you would expect it to be informed. And in order to do that, you have to have instruction of some kind. It's very, very easy to inform a mini-public, but what about the whole public? So a mini-public has about 100 people in it. The whole public during a referendum has all eligible voters. So I worked a little bit on the Bougainville process that might happen next year, the referendum. And I've learned from that there are a lot of impediments. So there's illiteracy, there's a lack of transportation, communication infrastructure, and so on. But even so, it can be done. So you can rely on schools and churches, for example, in Bougainville, and instead of having online tutorials, which would be the ideal. Or you can use phones. They only have 2G in Bougainville, really? So really just text. But you can be creative. That's the shotgun referendum, which is a deliberative conflict settling referendum, hopefully. So now there are two consequences that hopefully, again, can result from it. The first one is that you achieve settlement in the first place, meaning that you actually have an agreement signed. And here there's a two-step argument. Can you show the second? Yeah. So the first step is that, and this is not particularly original, I've mentioned this already, where there's a clash of values, for example, between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, what we require is just a limited modification of values, in this case, values of identity, and we can try to, if we can actually accomplish that, then we might actually be able to settle the conflict. So it tends to be, according to a number of other people, this is not our argument, that just settling those clashes of value rather than tinkering with different constitutional models is the more effective approach. Not for every conflict, but for many conflicts. So if that's the case, then the question is, who's better at deliberating about values? And the answer, according to some people, surprisingly, it's really not us. It's it's not the academics, it's the relatively undereducated, non-elites we'll call them, who are best positioned to deliberate over values. So elites of various kind are very good at fitting what they learn in terms of new information into existing categories by factual cherry picking and logical sophistry that basically gets them to the point that they wanted to reach in the first place. So relatively less formally educated people are to some extent actually not burdened by that problem. So they're better public value deliberators. So Celine Colombo, for example, finds that there's a surprisingly small effect on deliberation due to education. But elite polarization has a negative statistically significant effect on reasoning. I've worked on this too, and also the political psychologist Dan Kahan points out that better educated individuals are again uniquely able to agree with their mates in the particular group that they belong with, and so they're less open-minded, basically. So often, the last people we want to see lead a conflict settlement process might be the elites whose self-identity, their positions of power, and so on keep them from being particularly motivated to end the conflict. They're insulated often from the consequences of conflict, like violence and instability and economic decline and forced migration. So ordinary citizens might actually be more eager to see a conflict end, and so essentially the two-step argument here is that value deliberation is the sine qua non of peacemaking in many cases, and non-elites are often better at that. And so this is how we come to our preference for referendums. But the shotgun referendum is not just a standard referendum, it's one that has these deliberative supports built into it, including those slightly coercive means to make it focus on public values. And actually, so I went to Israel and the Palestinian territories, and I spoke to people across the spectrum, and I suggested this to them. And to my incredible surprise, everyone agreed that this is a possible sort of way out of the impasse. I mean, they didn't think it was obviously going to work, and it's not obvious that it would work, but there's a lot of disaffection with the stalled state of elite-led peacemaking. So if you can actually get non-elites involved, you might actually be more likely to achieve settlement, so the signing of an agreement. But just because we've signed an agreement doesn't mean that it'll manage conflict. It might just be a fleeting agreement. So for a few reasons, we think that the referendum, if well designed, can actually be useful in constitutionalizing and crystallizing the settlement. So the first one is kind of obvious. The popular sovereignty, if you go back to John Locke, James Madison, Rousseau, Sieyès, and others, they've always assumed that constitutions rest on popular sovereignty. The question was always, though, whether they should have referendums or not, and they tended to say no, that representative democracy was actually better for constitutional authority, for establishing the authority of a constitution. So essentially what we're doing here is we're mixing deliberative and constitutional theory, and we've come to a number of reasons why the referendum actually might be useful. But essentially what we're saying is that constitutions tend to endure. That's one of the criteria of constitutions, that they are enduring, and they're also fundamental. But the sort of third criterion that we can point to is that they have to be seen as constitutions. So it's this circular argument that the Constitution is a constitution if it's recognized as a constitution. So the question is, when does that happen? So in part, running a referendum helps to make that happen. So we know from recent evidence that democratization is good for constitutional endurance. But still we have that question of whether it should be referendums or representative democracy. So I won't go through all this too much, but if you look at the next page those are the three criteria I mentioned, but then after that, so this is actually something that I did years ago where we showed that when it comes to constitutional issues, the amount of trust we put in deliberative referendums, so this would be a mini public followed by a referendum, is far greater than the amount of trust we put in parliamentarians to pursue the constitutional change. So this is just in Australia, but our our assumption is that it would be a stronger result and even more exaggerated result in many conflict societies because the trust in government and people in government is already lower there. It's not. It's a little bit of a complicated point, so I don't think that's necessarily always going to be true. But the point is that even though we have to trust legislators to represent us democratically when it comes to ordinary lawmaking. When it comes to constitutional lawmaking, we don't have particularly high trust. And so this is, we think, the best way of looking at popular legitimacy, to look at it through the lens of what actual people think is legitimate. And so we found that there's strong evidence, in Australia at least, that a referendum, if it's deliberative, can help to raise the level of trust in the process. So then there's kind of a flip side argument, which is that if constitutional change is best pursued via a referendum, it also works the other way around. So the presence of a referendum also helps to signal that a new norm is constitutional status, because the referendum and the constitutional change tend to go hand in hand. So it's a bit of a multi-pronged argument. And it's really one that we're still working on, so it's definitely one that I think you can poke holes in to some extent. So I look forward to robust questioning. But then just really quickly, because I'm probably running out of time, the last 2 points are that a referendum can help to signal that a particular norm should be seen as dominant vis-a-vis all other norms. So it has a constitutional sort of coordinating function. It establishes that, for example, that an end to apartheid is the norm that is now supported, even though before then the racists and others had been loud in the media, and it hadn't been clear which norms were really the dominant ones. So a referendum helps to establish a new set of norms, including a constitutional settlement, as fundamental and paramount. And then finally, the deliberative referendum, because of its focus on values, is very sort of consonant with constitutions, which are generally value documents. So they're not about the particulars of law. They're about the broad sort of commitments to values that we have in our society. So all of this leads to basically 2 points. A weak claim, which is that we ought to favor referendums for peacemaking. But really there are a lot of caveats and doubts about that, because it depends on how we design the referendum. So the stronger point is that if we design the referendum as a shotgun referendum with supports for deliberation, then we at least feel much less equivocal about favoring the referendum for peacemaking. If it has those deliberative supports, and especially if they work, then that would be significant. So it's not just direct democracy that helps, we think, to build this constitutional endurance for settlements, but also deliberative direct democracy. And so that's all I want to say. This is kind of a whirlwind tour of 4 chapters in our book. Look forward to your questions.